Afternoon and welcome back to Carnegie Council's Lunchtime Webinar Series. I'm Joel Rosenthal, President of the Carnegie Council. Like many of you watching, we're working remotely these days. However, we're using this time to reach out to our senior fellows, friends, and constituents to talk about the important issues in ethics and public life that are at the heart of the Council's work. So thank you all for joining us. Today we'll be discussing some of the work of the Carnegie Climate Governance Initiative, or C2G for short. Since its launch in 2017, C2G is focused on encouraging the creation of effective and inclusive governance for emerging technologies that would seek to deliberately alter the climate. C2G is impartial regarding the research, testing, or potential use of any proposed technologies or interventions. Instead, they're focused on expanding the conversation from the scientific and research community to the global policymaking arena. Today's conversation is with Cynthia Scharf, C2G's Senior Strategy Director. Cynthia previously served as the Head of Strategic Communications and Chief Speechwriter on climate change for the United Nations Secretary General from 2009 to 2016. She's also worked on global humanitarian and public health emergencies at the United Nations and with international non-governmental organizations in the Balkans, Africa, the United Kingdom, and Russia. Combating climate change requires cooperation on a global scale, much like the efforts to mitigate the effects of the COVID-19 pandemic. Cynthia's experience with C2G in the United Nations has given her valuable insight into the mechanisms of global cooperation, and the history of international climate negotiations shows just how difficult that cooperation can be. So it's our pleasure to welcome Cynthia to this webinar, which we've titled Prospects for Global Coordination in an Age of Pandemics and Emerging Climate Technologies. Now, before turning to Cynthia, just a word about our format. Cynthia will begin with a brief presentation, 5, 10, 15 minutes, whatever you like, Cynthia. And we'll follow that with a brief conversation with me. We encourage all of our attendees to submit questions through the chat function, as the last part of the program will be interactive, with digital content producer Alex Woodson passing along the questions from the audience. So with that introduction, I'm going to turn things over to Cynthia, who is coming to us live from her home outside New York City. Over to you, Cynthia.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Joel, and welcome to all of you who are tuning in today. As Joel said, I am the strategy director for C2G. And let me just explain a bit more about what it is that we do and why this conversation is relevant today in the context of the pandemic. So this initiative is funded by philanthropic donors, and the goal is to take a conversation that began in the research and the scientific community globally and shift it, broaden it into the policymaking world. And by policymakers, I mean at the multilateral level, the United Nations, other organizations, to the national government level, and then to society writ large, because we strongly believe that the issue we work on is not just for experts. It would involve every country in the world if some of these technologies were used, and hence every society, every community, including the most vulnerable, those who are most vulnerable from climate change. So as Joel mentioned, before I started at work at C2G, I was at the United Nations. And over that period of time and over the lifespan of C2G, we've really seen the issue of climate change come into the international agenda in ways that it previously had not. And the irony for us is that I think just in January, we were starting to see some of the seeds that C2G has planted in terms of conversations about these technologies really start to sprout, that there was growing interest that was tangible in the kind of work that we are doing. And that was very heartening because our work is around a difficult topic. It's about what additional tools might humanity consider as the planet continues to warm, as climate impacts continue to increase. And if there are any lessons to be learned from the pandemic that are transferable to the world that I currently work on, It's that we ignore science at our own peril. We also ignore risk management at our own peril. That controversial, difficult topics are necessary to be discussed in the public arena, and that we as a society potentially will inflict even greater harm on ourselves by not having these difficult conversations up front. So for example, in terms of climate technologies that deliberately would alter the one climate we share, that's a really touchy topic. And I completely understand why that is so. Because we're talking about something that is deliberate. So of course, we all know that the climate is changing. Scientists have told us that for the last 30 years. What makes these technologies different is that it is an endeavor that is deliberately trying to manipulate the climate system to reduce climate risks, to reduce suffering. So that's a very, very big gamble. And I'm not a scientist, and C2G is not a scientific initiative. It is about public policy. How do we make these decisions on how to deliberately manipulate a climate that affects all of us, the entire world? How do we make those governance decisions? Who decides? Who has the authority to decide? Who has the legitimacy to decide? Who's in the room? Who's not? These are all major challenges for governance, for multilateral governance. And one other key point about the pandemic that is related to our work is really the issue of multilateralism. How does humanity cope with crises that are inherently global in nature? The pandemic is one of those examples that is very clearly a global challenge. So is something to deliberately alter the one climate that we have. How do we look at that issue? Is multilateralism the way that we need to go? Because the threats don't carry passports, they traverse across borders? Or do we retreat into a more isolationist mode? Draw up the drawbridge, shut the borders, take things on at a national level, where we potentially might feel we're in more control, but there's also the risk that these inherently global challenges will not respond to that kind of go it alone attitude. So that has been shown to be the case in the pandemic. It's also very, very true for climate change itself as a policy issue, and also for the governance of these technologies that would deliberately seek to shape the climate. So again, the science-based approach to looking at these issues, we can't ignore the science. Secondly, a risk management approach. And thirdly, multilateralism. What do we need to do to enhance the effectiveness of responses to global threats? So I would just like to start with that preface and also say that the pandemic, of course, has been the first priority of every government. That is the way it should be. It is a direct threat to the lives and the well-beings of millions of people. However, going forward, we cannot let the urgent, our response to the pandemic, undermine what is essential. And as anyone who's worked in the climate field knows, we have no time to lose to address the global challenge that is climate change. So we cannot let the urgent response to the pandemic, which has to be there, undermine efforts to also work on climate change and to explore some of these very difficult issues about how the world would address and govern technologies that would affect every person on the planet. So with that introduction, I hand it back over to Joel.
Cynthia, that's a terrific introduction. Thank you. I have a lot of questions here, and I want to urge the audience to begin to use the chat function to weigh in. So let me just begin a little bit on coming back to ethics.
Mhm.
and, how you think about, and to use the language of, values and interests, if
Mhm.
you will.
Mhm.
Because there does seem to be something that really is connected between the intervention into the natural world that C2G is looking into, right? This is a
Mhm.
human intervention into nature, unprecedented in a way. And obviously with the pandemic as well, nature is talking to us, and we will intervene in some capacity. But could you just share a little bit about how you think about this question of values, and what values are sort of primary in your thinking as we think about, human intervention into nature at the global scale? You left the conversation. Your first point was science, right? Science, in a sense, embodies a sense of values. Could you just elaborate a little bit more on that?
Sure. Thanks for the question.
Yeah.
So clearly, both the pandemic and climate change have, at their base, a scientific understanding of how the world works. And as we've seen in the last 20 years, this opening chapter of the Anthropocene has brought us questions to be addressed concerning science, concerning governance, but also concerning profound reflections on what does it mean for our species to have an outsized footprint on not only the planet itself, but all the species that are here in our ecosystems. We're in a new era. Humanity has not had these inherently kind of global challenges in the past. And where do values fit into this? Well, as if we say science is at the heart of some of the decision making, the bigger question really is who gets to decide?
Hmm.
Who has the authority? Who has legitimacy in society to make these kinds of decisions? And how do we look at issues of vulnerability, whether that means vulnerability to a climate change impact, for example, or vulnerability to a disease based on demographic factors? How do we triage our responses? How do we think about intergenerational equity? Because at least on the climate side of things, next and future generations will be affected by decisions that are made or not made right now. And in fact, one of the most chilling quotes that I've read in the recent past is by a group of scientists that said the next 20, 30 years will have an effect on history that goes far beyond even 10,000 years. That is an awe-inspiring and very heavy responsibility. So a very important part of these discussions is about how do we think about ourselves and ensuring safety and reducing risks, but also what are the potential consequences for generations who follow us? And how do we inculcate that sense of intergenerational responsibility into our own thinking? How do we make sure that those people who are most affected, be that by a pandemic, be it by climate change, or most affected from any potential use of a climate altering technology, how do we make sure their voices are also heard and part of this? And just one last point, many have said that with the capabilities we now have, technological capabilities, that we're playing God. Oftentimes when people hear about things deliberately manipulating the climate, their response is, so we're playing God now? And that brings up issues of hubris, of human hubris toward other species, toward future generations, but also at a profound, almost theological or mythological level. What is it that humanity should or should not be doing in terms of interfering with the creation, as some believers call it, or with nature, with ecosystems? Are we deluding ourselves in thinking that we have things figured out so well that we can deliberately manipulate this ecosystem? Many also say, do we abdicate our responsibility to do so? There's a flip side to that. If we have science as one of our tools, should we not be using that to potentially alleviate suffering, alleviate risks, help future generations? So C2G does not take a stand on whether use of these technologies is good or bad, but what it's doing is raising questions about the ethics, the values that underpin any possible discussion of how we might govern these, both at a local and a national level, but also internationally.
Great, thank you. So to follow up on that, that's a big ask to, bring these voices in and to have a global discussion about the values and interests and so on these very profound questions. So that raises the question about leadership. How important is leadership? And again, maybe starting with C2G and then maybe moving into the pandemic, if you will, but how is this coordinated? Who leads? What have you seen and what do you think can and should be done from a leadership point of view?
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Joel. That's a very good question. I would just start by, before I get into C2G specific work, on climate change writ large. So many of us working in C2G also worked at the UN for the former Secretary General Ban Ki-moon, specifically during the period where the Paris Agreement came into being. So from the years leading up to the Paris Agreement and then a few years after that when it was ratified and countries met within the framework of the agreement in Paris. Leadership was essential to have the Paris Agreement come to fruition. It was essential that US and China both acknowledged responsibility for the climate change issues that we see at varying levels, but both acknowledged they have responsibility. And countries came forward in a spirit of, let's see what we can do together that is qualitatively different than what we might be able to do by ourselves, because we realize this is a global challenge. So in the arena of post-Paris, when we're looking at potential technologies to supplement, not substitute, supplement what we already have to do on climate change, which is reduce emissions to zero and then net negative, scientists have been talking about potential ways to do that using some technologies. And what we're finding as we take that conversation from the scientific community and broaden it into the policy world is, first of all, there's a lot of awareness raising and information sharing and dialogue that needs to happen, because that conversation is really at the early stages in the policymaking world. And a big part of what C2G has been doing for the last few years is raising awareness and actually saying that we need a risk management approach to thinking about our climate future, our shared climate future. And the greater risk is in not talking about some of these options, some of these potential tools, not only because of their very serious potential risks, but also their potential benefits. How might they affect other areas of the Sustainable Development Agenda? So bringing that together in a package and saying to policymakers, please, you need to learn about this. We can't put the genie back in the bottle scientifically, but you need to come forward and form your own opinion about how these technologies should be governed. And leadership is essential in this regard. And leadership and governance is not just in some kind of ivory tower or some kind of marble hallway. It is about from the grassroots to the grass tops. It's about leaders at the civic level, leaders at the national level, leaders at the multilateral level, coming together to learn more about what possible options might exist, and then making their own views about what need to happen to address some of these concerns. And so leadership is essential to really bring that debate forward, to make sure that it's inclusive, that it's transparent, and that leaders start talking across borders, because these are really global challenges. We are in a situation now where the pandemic, of course, has come to the top of the international agenda. All leaders' eyes are focused on how do we save lives? What do we need to do to address this urgent challenge? But our message now is that, again, we can't let the urgent undermine the essential. And we have known for the last 30 years, and in particular in the last several years, it is urgent to act on climate risks, to reduce what we can in terms of emissions and look at how we might govern other potential tools or technologies that scientists are discovering. And leadership here is also critical. And so we're in a period where we can't lose precious time dealing with these questions. We can't pretend they are going away. We need leaders at the civic level, at the national level, and the international level to continue to debate these very hard topics, continue to look at the climate challenge.
Cynthia, that's helpful. And in the past, you've spoken before about the need for awareness that there are no risk-free options. You know, often when we talk about ethics and governance, I think to the casual observer, people will think, well, oh, you know, ethics, that just means compliance. It means, you know, aspirations and so on. And that's all fine and good. It can help set direction, if you will. These are the values that matter to us. We want to go in this direction. But the reality is, as you've seen in C2G, and as we may be seeing in the pandemic as well, that you may have two goods that compete, or you have values that clash. You know, so maybe you could just say a little bit more about, you talked before about risk management, but could you say a little bit more about the illusion that we could be risk-free in any of these potential paths forward?
Yeah, you just nailed it right on the head. The illusion that we're coming into a future where there's, you know, options that are easy to address and that there's one road ahead. Unfortunately, our message is no. There is no risk-free option when we look at the issue of climate change. Because even if all the commitments that were pledged back in 2015 in the Paris Agreement were fulfilled, and they have not been thus far, we're still looking at perhaps even doubling the limit that scientists say is the safe limit. So a few years ago, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC, came out with a report saying that they think the safer level is to stay at 1.5 degrees temperature rise and not even go up to 2 degrees. But unfortunately, right now, we are approaching double 1.5 or even 3 degrees Celsius temperature rise, which is pretty much catastrophic. And business as usual, so what we're currently doing is approaching 4 degrees centigrade temperature rise, which is absolutely catastrophic at every level for human civilization and for the continuation of ecosystems and species as we know it. So we're in a very, very tight spot. We don't have time to lose. And that was a key message that the IPCC put forward. And so our message as C2G, as we talk to leaders at all levels of society and all countries, is that we can't live with the illusion that we're going to get there using tools that have been tried in the past, that we need to go beyond just reducing emissions now. And according to the IPCC, we also need to be sucking carbon out of the atmosphere. In other words, removing carbon in addition to removing our reducing our emissions. So we both have to reduce emissions and remove them to try to stay at this 1.5 centigrade safety level. That's a very, very tall order. And why do I say that we're looking at options that are not risk-free? Well, let's look at the first option, which is basically reduce emissions. Why is that risky? Well, simple answer is because we're not doing it. We're not doing it at nearly the speed or the scale that science tells us we need to. And we've been on this path for decades, and we have not responded in the ways we know that science is telling us what we need to do. Now science is saying, not only do you have to reduce, you have to remove existing emissions from the atmosphere. So that's a second step. We have to reduce, and now we have to remove. And then there are scientists saying, even that may not be enough if we're really looking at a 3 or 4 degrees Celsius temperature rise within the lifespan of someone who is born today. That is only 80 years from now. And with populations aging, 80 is not just restrained to a small segment of the global population. So there are people who are alive today, who are being born as we speak, who will be alive in the year 2100. And scientists are saying the situation at 3 or 4 degrees Celsius by 2100 is so catastrophic that we might need to look at additional technologies to help lower some of those risks. And one of those sets of technologies is something called solar radiation modification, or SRM in short. And what it does is it seeks to dim the sun, to reflect incoming solar radiation back into space, and therefore cool global temperatures. So it would not address the cause of climate change, but it would address one of the symptoms, one of the manifestations of climate change, which is global temperature rise. However, that's anything but a free lunch. It's anything but a silver bullet. That option has numerous risks on an environmental level, on a governance level, on a security, geopolitical level, and on an ethical level. These questions of justice, of intergenerational justice, of the voices of the most vulnerable being part of the conversation, and on the issue of human hubris. Are we overreaching? Are we trying something that we deliberately should not be doing? And these questions are really at the heart of any kind of governance considerations and at the heart of risks. Risks are not only physical risks, they can be ethical risks, they can be governance risks.
That's great. So can you just say a little bit more building on that in terms of how you envision governance of these issues? So we do have some traditional multilateral institutions, built out of the UN system. Again, making a parallel to the pandemic or the moment, everybody now is thinking about WHO, right, as a coordinating institution for public health.
Right.
Can you just say a little bit about, from the climate perspective, what you've learned and, in terms of climate governance and so on, what's the health of the institutions there? How do you see that going? And, and could you also, if you're comfortable, speculate a little bit about, which way the pandemic will move? Will it move, do you think, a tide toward recognition that these are, these problems, because of their scale, because we're talking about, nature at the planetary scale, will require some kind of coordinating mechanism, a governance mechanism? Or, as you said before, what's your sense of worry that this will not happen and that there'll be a retreat and that the consequences could be quite dire?
Thanks, Joel. That's a really important point. In some ways, it feels like multilateralism itself is on trial with the pandemic as well as on climate change. With the pandemic, we've seen, many people have seen the value of an international body like WHO in terms of preparing agreed upon guidelines for testing, for risk surveillance, for treatment, and the value of collaboration that goes across borders, just like the virus goes across borders. The tremendous importance of transparency, the tremendous importance of monitoring and evaluating and testing in a transparent way so that the public trusts the information it is receiving. In the climate change arena, some of those same issues apply. So I would say, in terms of climate multilateralism, we really hit a high point in 2015 with the Paris Agreement on Climate Change. 195 countries came forward and basically said, we're in. This is a global problem, and we need to respond in a globally coordinated manner. So issues of transparency, of monitoring emissions, of reporting of emissions, of verifying emissions, the importance of methodologies for accounting, the importance of a liability mechanism, all of these things are benefits that global cooperation can bring. However, there is a flip side. And I think in some of the responses we've been seeing from certain countries, from certain leaders on the pandemic, we've seen the opposite of a multilateral spirit. We've seen we can do it on our own, or we don't trust X country's data, or we are not going to share some of our pharmaceutical vaccine research, or we're not going to share protective equipment with other countries that might need it at the moment. So I very much do think that we're at this pivotal moment in multilateralism where we're facing global challenges. And so one response is more investment, more energy devoted to the multilateral cooperation. Or you're also seeing responses that say, hey, globalization got us where we are. That virus came from some other place, not from our own country. And so globalization, multilateralism is a threat in that mindset. In the climate change discussions, as I said, we reached a high point on multilateralism in 2015. When we're talking about some of these new technologies, the kinds that reflect sunlight back into space, that dim the sun to lower global temperatures, that's inherently a global technology. We need a global mechanism to look at how that might be done, how research might be shared, how monitoring, verification, reporting might be transparent, should be transparent, to engender trust among all governments, among all populations. But one could envisage a scenario where one of these technologies is tested or potentially even deployed by a small group of countries, or one country, or even a non-state actor. And that feels very, very threatening. And national legislation alone will not be sufficient. There needs to be a multilateral response to something that is inherently multilateral in nature. However, that shift, that dynamic between nationalism, populism on the one hand, multilateral cooperation on the other, that dynamic is going to be constantly in play over the next few years as the climate crisis continues to worsen. And I think it is not a sure bet, a guarantee that all countries will see and value multilateral cooperation. That's not a given. From our perspective, we think it is a wiser course. But as I also just said, there's risks in every option going forward. So we're really at a pivot point in human history, looking at how we address these challenges that transcend borders.
That's great. It's particularly appropriate. We're talking here under the auspices of Carnegie Council. You know, Andrew Carnegie, over 100 years ago, thought there was a multilateral solution to the great power conflict that he could see coming. And, you know, his answer was to create a better future. And for him, that future was the creation of a world court where great powers would bring their disputes, creation of a League of Nations for collective security, you know, have the great powers sign treaties of arbitration to agree to take their conflicts to the court and so on. And Carnegie was a great optimist. You know, he believed that we could create just a new way of doing things. Mm-hmm. And not only a new way, but then for him, it was a new institution. So my question for you, I'm just curious how you're thinking about this, Cynthia. Do you think that, first of all, where do you find optimism? Do you, there's got to be something that you can imagine a better future, if you will, right? That's what Carnegie was really all about. How do we imagine a better future? For him, it was the institutions of multilateralism, but it could be something different. It could be, again, just global coordination in some way. But how do you handle the optimism question? Where do you see it going from an optimistic point of view?
Right. I'm often asked this question. And I start by referencing actually my own family. My daughter is named Hope. And there's a very long family story behind that I won't get into, but we deliberately named her Hope. So this is not a question that I take lightly. It cuts very much across both professional and personal values. But my answer when people ask me, do you have hope? My answer is that's the wrong question. For me, the more important question is, do we have courage? Do we as society have the courage to look at these extremely challenging concerns, these extremely challenging global issues, face them squarely, have an honest debate about the risks we face? Because again, in the climate world, there is no risk-free option. And then come forward in an honest, sober way and say, we've looked at this and we are considering this path forward. So it starts with really a reckoning of where we are and trying to bring together different parts of society to address a very knotty problem, a very ethically challenged problem. So I do think that multilateralism provides optimism. It provides reason for hope. But I also know, and even in my short lifetime, we've seen pendulum swings on the value placed on globalization, on multilateralism. And as we've learned with the pandemic, everything can change overnight when you have a global threat. And so optimism comes at the personal level, I think, when people feel like they can do something that helps alleviate the suffering of someone else, or that makes a community feel more resilient or provides a sense of solidarity across borders or within communities. I think that gives me a sense of optimism. But I would say at the global level, I'm probably more on the realist side in thinking that, yes, multilateral does provide many benefits, but we also have to see what is the current crop of leadership the world now has. And is that necessarily the way that we're going to go? And we can't afford illusions. I guess that's the point. We cannot afford illusions. We need to bring forth difficult questions. The risks of not doing so are greater than the risks of doing so.
That's great, helpful. So I'm going to go to Alex Woodson now. Alex is our moderator, and he's going to relay some questions from those listening in.
Yeah,
Okay.
thanks, Joel. We have a lot of great questions. Unfortunately, we won't be able to get to all of them. Just wanted to start with one, continuing the discussion of multilateralism. This is from Jan Art Schulte at the University of Gothenburg and the University of Duisburg, Essen. He writes, Cynthia, I hear an implicit equation of global cooperation and multilateralism. Have the last few decades not suggested that global cooperation needs additional or even alternative institutional designs to intergovernmental organizations? Don't we see again with COVID-19 that global cooperation through multilateralism, in this case, the WHO, falls way short? Do we not need to be more creative with transgovernmental networks, epistemic communities, multi-stakeholder arrangements, et cetera? Thanks.
Wow, that's a long question. Yeah, I'd start by saying none of the institutions that are responding to this pandemic are perfect. That's because human beings aren't perfect. WHO is a member-driven organization. Its members provide the funding, its members set the policy. And within WHO, they also have very strong regional governorship of different areas around the world. And so WHO is not the end all be all. Each country also has its own national healthcare systems that it needs to rely on. But I think we do see the value of global standard setting, of global transparency, of global monitoring. So I would come down on the side of net benefits to a multilateral approach, but again, without illusions that WHO, if it had all the money in the world or every single member behind it agreed on one solitary path forward, that isn't going to exist. And so we need to supplement at other levels, at the community level, at the national level, in addition to what a global body could bring. And on the climate side, when the Paris Agreement was finally brought forward and ratified, there was never any illusion among those countries that it would solve everything. It was the first step, the first major step in over 20 years to address a global problem. But no one there had any illusions that it would solve every dimension of climate change. It was a precursor to even more difficult global challenges and discussions that need to be had. So again, I'm I'm coming down on the side of honesty and sober realism about the choices we have and the values of governance at all different levels.
Okay, we'll go to another question. This one is from Tobias Schaefer. He writes, how could the time gained in terms of CO2 emissions through the pandemic be leveraged to proceed with climate mitigation actions? What lessons for or further adaptation measures to climate change can be taken from this unexpected interruption of damaging emissions?
Yeah, good questions. Well, as we've seen during the pandemic, emissions have gone down. Airline travel has dramatically been reduced, automobile travel, people staying at homes. So obvious causes of carbon in the atmosphere coming from the energy sector and the transport sector. That has been one positive attribute coming from this pandemic. And the other is really seeing that radical lifestyle changes can take place within a week, that something that once seemed unthinkable, with leadership, with global coordination, with a sense of shared solidarity, shared risk, actually can come into being. And we've also seen how people at a very human or community level have really responded and shown solidarity, shown compassion, demonstrated empathy. All those are signs, and creativity and ingenuity. All these are signs of optimism coming from a situation which, of course, en masse has been tremendously tragic. So that gives some reason to hope that on the climate change front, that adaptation, meaning adapting to inevitable climate risks, could happen, and could happen on a much quicker time scale than we previously had thought. And it also helps us see that maybe all the business travel that many of us have taken over the last few decades, maybe all of that isn't necessary. Maybe we can do with more video conferencing like this luncheon discussion, that these lessons or experiences that we've had during this pandemic can be taken in a positive light and used to help address some of the challenges of climate change. That said, they are not an overall solution. The problem is much more systemic. It's much more global. So let's take the good from what we can, but realizing that there's so much more that needs to be done at an urgent and essential level to abate the climate crisis that we're in.
Okay, we'll go to another question. This is from Anil Karnani. He writes, climate change is a perfect example of tragedy of the commons. I think the economist Nordhaus has argued that international cooperation has failed so far because of the free rider problem. He concludes that international cooperation requires a mechanism to penalize free riders who do not cooperate. Do you agree with that assessment? If yes, how can we implement a system that incorporates such penalties?
I know of Nordhaus's work. He won the Nobel Prize. He's a very eminent economist. And the free rider problem. It's not for me to say what is necessary or not necessary, what is good or bad. It's really for governments, who are the ones who make decisions at the UN, at the WHO, governments in the G20, making decisions for the G20. It's for them to decide. But I do think it's incredibly important to have a rich society-wide debate about these issues, because the implications of climate change, of course, affect every country, every sector of society. So having a society-wide discussion in which values, interests, ethical concerns, intergenerational concerns can feed into that discussion is to everyone's benefit.
Okay. This question is from Ilgu Osler. She writes, can you talk about the intersection of science and human rights? What are some of the potential pitfalls and policy in the current global governance processes for C2G?
That's a really important question, and it's something that we are putting our heads to in the coming years when we think about these challenges. For example, some of the approaches that scientists have recommended to remove CO2 from the air might involve huge swaths of land. And so in that scenario, who makes the decision what the best use of land might be? Is it to address a climate risk? Is it to address global hunger? Is it to address crowded urbanization? Who's making that decision about how limited resources like land are used? There are many who fear that those who actually inhabit those spaces would not be included in decision-making processes about them. So that is just one very obvious concern, is on use of land and how that might affect human rights. The other human right, the most basic one, is right to life, right to survival. And when we're talking about climate change potentially engendering massive sea level rises that flood out hundreds of millions of people and spark a migration at levels that we've never before encountered, whose rights will be respected? Who is going to help those people? Where does our sense of solidarity come into play? So human rights are an essential part of this discussion. Who gets to decide? Who makes those decisions on behalf of whom? And how do we as a society protect those people who are most vulnerable to climate change impacts? So human rights is very much a part of these discussions. It was a part of the discussions that led to the Paris Agreement, and it needs to be something that is inculcated as we think about any potential use of technologies to deliberately alter the climate.
Okay, this question comes from Rosemary Wakeman. We have 20 years of experience of shared international governance approaches to terrorism. Are there lessons learned from meeting that risk that can be applied?
Interesting question. I guess I'd respond by referring to what some militaries around the world have said on that question. If I understand her point accurately, it's that there may be risks that are low probability, but have enormous consequences. So for years, scientists have been warning us about the possibility of pandemics, whether it was SARS, whether it was Ebola or avian flu or MERS. There have been scientists raising the alarm about pandemics for decades. The probability of any one such virus coming forward is something I'm not exactly qualified to guess, but it was considered plausible. And in that sense, preparation, honest, transparent discussion, preparatory measures by governments could show incalculable benefits. And I think the pandemic has shown that that would be true in this situation. If the threat of pandemic had been taken more seriously, perhaps by certain governments or by the global bodies, we would not find ourselves with shortages of necessary medical equipment, as we have found out. In terms of climate change, the risks are very great. And in fact, the science is showing us that if anything, we've been too cautious. We have been underestimating the risks, including the probability of truly tragic consequences. And so to err on the side of more preparedness, of more resilience building, of more honest, transparent dialogue about measures that cut across countries and within countries themselves on how to address the climate crisis, that is to our benefit. And so the preparatory mode of perhaps little prevalence, but catastrophic consequences is something that, again, some militaries follow when they address terrorism or other crises, but also has a place in smart risk management about climate change.
Okay, we'll go to this question from Kenneth Miller. Ethical analysis will require impact reports, which require predictive models, which we know are highly complex and incomplete. How do we manage this process to reduce risk and ever get to a level of comfort in making these decisions?
I think the answer is there's no easy answer. Levels of risk depend on where one sits, I guess, in society. There's an aphorism that says where one stands depends on where one sits. So what might be an acceptable risk for me living an hour north of Manhattan may not at all be an acceptable risk for somebody living near Grand Central Station. So I do think that there are a wealth of factors that come into risk management. Models aren't perfect. Scientists will very often say that straight up front. Their models are not perfect, and models contain assumptions. as do economic models. Assumptions about human behavior, assumptions about responses, assumptions about values. So there is no perfect model, but all of these factors need to come into play when assessing risks, from the physical risks to the equity risks to even the more, as you could say, maybe even archetypal risks about the proper role of human intervention in nature.
Okay. So this question, you touched on this answer a little bit before, but I see another question about this too. So I'll just put this out there again. This is from Aminata Jeta from the Gambia. Question is, considering the poor nature of the economics of developing countries, which makes it difficult for them to control climate change issues, what options do you think are available for these countries to control the borrow's consequences of climate change, especially with greenhouse gas emissions from developed countries?
Well, she has hit the nail on the head. Equity is at the very heart of the international climate change negotiations. Issues of equity, who is responsible for the situation we're in now, who is responsible to help ameliorate it, to help not only reduce emissions, but remove emissions, on whose timetable, how does this affect future generations? So equity is at the very, very heart of all the international climate discussions. When you strip away perhaps some of the more turgid terminology, it's about what's fair. And the question she asks is a question that's been at the heart of these discussions for a long time. C2G, which is talking about supplements, not substitutes, for traditional tools to address climate change, is looking at this question of equity and addressing who needs to be in the room to have that conversation about how these technologies are governed. It might be a very different answer that we hear from developing countries on whether or not such research or even potential use might happen. There are many in the developing world who have no illusions about how difficult this crisis is, how catastrophic it already is, how much suffering it is already bringing, in addition to what future challenges may bring. And if there is some kind of technology that promises to ameliorate one of the symptoms of climate change, say global temperature, that could seem very interesting to a country that is on the climate front lines, that is greatly suffering right now from climate change. So I think we have to widen our lens when we think about the issues of equity and consider, again, where one stands on an issue may depend on where one sits.
Okay. Should we do another question or?
Alex, maybe last one. Yeah.
Okay.
Okay.
These aren't exactly questions. These are just topics. Probably a little too late
Sure.
to bring these into the debate, but just thought I'd throw them out there. Timothy Ellinger writes, he has two comments: the complex challenges of governments and integrated food, energy, water systems is at the heart of anthropogenic disturbance causing increased zoonotic diseases. The ability to bridge different metaphors of knowledge is essential. And then he writes, these diverse metaphors of knowledge cannot be bridged in a climate of mistrust. Political polarization cannot be mitigated without intellectual humility and valuing traditional knowledge.
I basically would agree with that. I don't see it, as you said, being a question. I would agree with that. There are many layers to these issues, like an onion to peel back. Many have said that the pandemic is also a consequence of environmental degradation, that with 8 billion people on the planet, approaching 10 billion or more in the next 80 years, our proximity to species that might have viruses that jump across species and mutate into viruses that affect us, that probability increases, just as the human footprint on the planet has increased the potential risks of climate change. So there are commonalities that tie these two issues together, in addition to looking at multilateralism as a possible amelioration of the situation. We also have to look at what are some of the impacts of our Anthropocene in the opening decades of this century.
Cynthia, thank you. I think with that, we'll move towards wrapping up, but I want to alert the audience. The C2G project has really been an inspiration to all of us at the council, and I think to a wider community, of looking at ethics in governance of emerging technologies. And I really appreciate the way in which you shared these thoughts this afternoon, which is the work of C2G is profound in and of itself, but we can see how it really affects some other really big questions that are facing us. Again, most urgently the pandemic, but there are others when we think about emerging technologies and everything from AI to cyber and other really fast moving global scale issues. The ethics and governance questions are so profound, and I hope our council is contributing in some way to the understanding of these issues. And your efforts today, really very much appreciated, and I'm sure a lot of people will take away some really valuable insights. And I hope I can persuade you, other members of the C2G team, and perhaps some people who are watching this afternoon to continue to participate in these conversations. They're really helpful to us. So thank you. And with that, I just want to let people know that we've recorded this webinar so you can share it with friends, and you can find it on the Carnegie YouTube channel and on the Carnegie Council website. We will have this recorded version, and then we'll also have a transcript as well for people to use. So I hope some of you will join us next week when our topic will be Democracy on the Verge, Leadership in Times of Crisis. Our guest will be Ted Widmer, Carnegie Council Senior Fellow and author of a new book called Lincoln on the Verge, 13 Days to Washington. So thank you all for joining us, and have a great week.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.